Our next perspective on personality comes from trait theorists. Trait theories were developed as an attempt to understand personality quickly, in order to be able to test to determine someone's personality. Now, I think about this on a certain level. The richness of everyone's personality and the nuances of everyone and the way they act and think. And then try to put that into several numbers. That's essentially what trait theorists try to do. It's a very difficult task. Why try to do it in the first place? Because employers would like to know something about people they're going to hire. And even if it's some superficial look, they think it's worthwhile to have a questionnaire. These individuals who make these up are called psychometricians, meaning people who measure the mind. And the first person to come up with a questionnaire or a personality test was Cattell. And Cattell discriminated between two levels of analysis here. There are source traits and surface traits. He tested for surface traits and then was able to combine these or break them down into like a common denominator, and he called that a source trait. So, in other words, on a test, if someone was judged to be friendly and compassionate and caring, or if they were judged to be friendly, they were always also judged to be compassionate and also caring. So Cattell took that as a sign that those three things must be roughly the same, and used a surface trait, which I've labeled nice. Okay, the person's nice. Nice was not one of his traits, but that gives you an idea. That's part of the process. But let's start at the beginning. He decided, when it came time for him to undertake this task, that the most thorough way to do this was to go to the English dictionary and find every adjective in the Webster's dictionary. Can you imagine the mundane, laborious task to find every and to write them down? Hopefully it's some way of getting this information from Webster's. I don't know. But he then went through and looked for redundancies. This was done on several different levels, but the first time they tested for redundancies, Cattell then was able to eliminate many of the adjectives and came up with a list of 170. He then made up a questionnaire with 170 and sought to find his L data. He did it. L data refers to, I want to get data on John Smith. So I'm going to ask people who know John Smith to fill out a questionnaire, meaning these 170 adjectives, and rate on what we call the Likert scale, 1 to 7. How much of this trait does John Smith have? Okay, so L data was ratings of a person by other people. Once he had this, he then wanted to have other data to look for convergence, or whether these measures were valid, whether there was a correlation coefficient high enough. So he looked for Q data. Q data, excuse me, is data when you ask John Smith, please take this questionnaire. So instead of somebody else rating you, you rate yourself. Q data, self-rating. Took this information and then did what was called a factor analysis. Factor analysis is like a type of correlation. And that's where he went from 170 adjectives down to his 16 traits. So he went from 170 surface traits to 16 source traits. Once again, it was a test, it was a filtering mechanism to look for redundancies. Like I was saying on the previous slide. If somebody's also friendly, compassionate, and caring, well then, if everybody's who's one of those is also the other two, then there must be some redundancy. So all of this was about winnowing down the number of traits necessary to measure a person's personality. And he determined that there were 16 source traits. And which he referred to as personality factors. And from this, he developed his 16 PF personality test. So based on answers given, Cattell was able to determine how high on a scale for all 16 of these personality factors a person was. So essentially this is breaking down a person's personality with all the complexities therein into 16 numbers. So, you know, critics would say it's very depersonalizing. Nevertheless, these are widely used. We're looking historically here. Cattell's is not widely used anymore, but it's the basis for the one that's used widely. And when you look for a job, perhaps after graduation, you may very well be asked to take one of these tests. Okay, now, the other individual we're going to look at here is Eysenck. And first, let's look at his constitutional theory of personality. Eysenck believed that based on your body type, your personality could be judged. In other words, 3 different types of personalities. The ectomorph, the thin person, anxious, energetic. The mesomorph, athletic, muscular, has leadership qualities. And the endomorph, someone who's overweight, rounder, just like Santa Claus, I guess, and less anxious, more prone to depression, more jovial. Okay, this is not well supported. Okay, this is one of his early works, and it really doesn't explain the wide variability in personality. Okay. Something else he put together, in terms of personality factors or traits, instead of 16, Eysenck thought that there were 2 critical traits. First, introversion, extroversion. This is something he took from Carl Jung. Carl Jung was the first to identify this. And you see examples here. Robin Williams is an excellent example of extroversion. Someone who communicates and is in touch with other people to a great degree. Introversion, where you want to be left alone, much more involved with your own thoughts. And I'm not even sure who that is in that hat there, but that's somebody, celebrity trying to hide in a crowd. Neuroticism and stability. This is also called instability and stability. Neuroticism refers to a type of anxiety disorder. And in general, Eysenck uses it to denote that someone who's not stable, who's close to a crisis. And the person that I've used here on the slide to symbolize that is Theodore Kaczynski, the former Unabomber, and stability, at least in Hollywood terms, very well embodied by Tom Hanks. And now, based on these, imagine that you draw yourself a grid where the y-axis is introversion, extroversion, and the x-axis is neuroticism and stability, and people's scores range low on neuroticism or high on neuroticism, low on extroversion, high on extroversion, and together a person's scores on these two measures lead to one of the personality types that Hippocrates and Galen, should actually say Galen, Hippocrates contributed, but it was actually Galen's theory, can lead to one of those personality types. So imagine you scored high on introversion and neuroticism. That means that you have a melancholic personality, a depressed personality. So people who are, perhaps you've heard this said, depression is anger directed inward. Okay? So you're introverted, you're pointing your emotional reaction inward, and you're neurotic or you're unstable. So you're blaming yourself. So melancholic. Introverted and stable is phlegmatic, listless, or apathetic. Extroverted and neurotic is choleric or angry. So this is anger directed outward. And extroverted stable is sanguine or happy. So interestingly, Eysenck was able to put together these stages, this framework, so it fits very well with Galen's work. Now, I've introduced both of these individuals and realize that the personality testing, the test that's used most often now, synthesizes Cattell's and Eysenck's work. And it's called the Big Five Personality Factors. And the acronym here to remember these, or the mnemonic device, is OCEAN. Okay, so openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. So the first initial of all five leads to OCEAN. So look at these: openness, non-openness, conscientiousness, undirectedness, and agreeableness, antagonism, all come from Cattell. And then you notice the other two are Eysenck's: extroversion, introversion, neuroticism, stability. And in other words, Eysenck, not enough factors, Cattell, too many. So 5 factors. Once again, seen from a certain perspective, there's an absurdity to trying to measure someone's personality in such a superficial way. Nevertheless, these things are widely used, and there's a lot of corporations that wouldn't think of hiring without these, without having people take this test.